Have you ever wondered why some people generate such a magnetic attraction that it is almost impossible to resist? That feeling of wanting to be close to someone, although you do not know exactly why, as if there is an invisible thread that pulls you towards that person. Today I will reveal something that could completely change the way you relate to who interests you. It is not magic. They are not cheap tricks. It is something much deeper that dates back centuries. Something that Machiavelli himself understood about human nature and that few dare to mention. If for a second this already aroused something in you, give it to him right now, because what I am about to share with you could revolutionize your love life completely. It is no accident that you are here, listening to this right now. There are truths that, once known, cannot be ignored. Prepare to enter a forbidden territory where masks fall and human connections become so intense that they create addiction. Let's go together on this trip. The first time I came across Machiavelli's writings was in a dark era of my life. I had just experienced the most painful rejection you can imagine. She simply looked me in the eye and said she didn't feel the same, that she had never felt it. I was frozen, as if someone had extracted all the air from my lungs. That night, in tears and with a shattered pride, I began to look for answers. I didn't want more superficial tips on being yourself or wait for the indicated. I needed something real, something that penetrated the true nature of human attraction. Among ancient books I found The Prince, but I did not read it as a political treaty. What I discovered was a map of psychological power that transcends the centuries. Machiavelli understood something fundamental. Human desire is not based on what we say we want, but on what we really yearn in our interior. And what we all yearn for, even if it costs us to admit it, is what we cannot completely control. Think about it for a moment. Have you ever noticed how your interest grows when you feel that you don't have total control of a situation? When she does not respond immediately to your message? When you cannot completely decipher what she thinks? When there is a mystery that you fail to solve? It is in that uncertainty where obsession is born, where emotional addiction begins. The first Machiavellian principle of seduction is based precisely on this: the power of calculated uncertainty. It is not about playing with someone's feelings, but about understanding that the human mind values more what it should strive to obtain. It is the difference between giving a diamond and making someone look for it in a maze. The perceived value changes completely. I remember the first time I applied this principle. After months of trying to impress a woman with constant attention, I changed my strategy. I began to show different facets of my personality. One day, he was the most attentive man in the world. The next one, he showed me completely absorbed in my own projects. I was not pretending. I simply let different aspects of my being go to the surface at different times. The result was fascinating. Suddenly, she started looking for me. I was no longer chasing her, but she trying to decipher me. "I never know what to expect from you," he told me one night. In his eyes, I could see a mixture of frustration and fascination. I was hooked, not to a cheap trick, but to the authentic complexity that we all have, but that we rarely dare to show. And here is the key that many misunderstanding. It is not manipulation, it is strategic authenticity. We are all multifaceted beings. We have moments of strength and vulnerability, certainty and doubt. The mistake we make is to show only one face, the one that we believe will be more accepted. What Machiavelli understood about power, I applied it to relationships. When you show all your cards immediately, when you are completely predictable, you are delivering your power. The human mind needs something to deal with, a puzzle to solve. Without that element, interest fades quickly. Think about the last time you felt inevitably attracted to someone. Could you predict each of its movements? Did you know exactly what I thought at all times? Probably not. It was that element of surprise, that impossibility of typecasting the person in a simple category that kept you hooked. The principle of calculated uncertainty should be applied with extreme care. It is not about being inconsistent by inconsistency, but about allowing the rich complexity of your being to manifest naturally. Sometimes you will be the shoulder in which she can cry A, other times you will be the one who needs support. Sometimes you will be the brilliant strategist, sometimes the dreamer who is lost in his thoughts. When you master this principle, something magical happens. She begins to invest emotional energy in understanding you, in anticipating you, and it is precisely that emotional investment that creates the first level of addiction. Because humans value what we invest, be it time, energy, or emotion. It is the IKEA paradox. We value more the furniture that we assemble ourselves than those who are already armed, even if they are identical. At the end of the day, the calculated uncertainty is nothing more than the art of being real, of human being, of showing your complexity instead of reducing you to a one-dimensional cartoon designed to please. And when you do this, you not only become more attractive, you also free yourself from the prison of the simplistic expectations that society has built for you. The second principle of Machiavellian seduction goes against everything they have taught us about romantic love. Since childhood, movies, songs, and stories bombard us with the idea that true love means total delivery, constant availability, and always prioritize the loved person. Machiavelli, with his cold but penetrating vision of human nature, would have smiled at such ingenuity, because he understood something that few dare to recognize. Excess availability kills desire. It took me painful years to understand this. I remember how I tried to prove my worth answering messages instantly, canceling plans with friends if she needed me, reorganizing my whole life to adapt to her schedules. I firmly believed that this total availability would demonstrate my love and commitment. The result was devastating. The more available it showed me, the less valued it was my presence. The principle of perceived value works as the most basic economy. The scarce is valuable. The abundant loses value. It is not cynicism, it is simply the way human psychology works. When something is constantly available, we take it for granted. It is the reason why we do not value the air we breathe until we are missing. When a man reorganizes his entire existence around a woman, he is unconsciously sending him two dangerous messages. First, he does not have a life of his own valuable enough. Second, that she does not need to try to maintain her interest. Both messages erode the attraction of deep and often irreversible ways. The first time I applied this principle was almost by accident. I had started an exciting personal project, and for the first time in a long time, my attention was genuinely divided. I couldn't answer messages immediately. I had to reject some invitations. I established clear limits on my available time. To my surprise, instead of moving away, she began to look for my attention. The conversations became deeper, the most intense moments, as if every minute shared had to take advantage of. This is the principle of magnetic vacuum. When you create spaces in your availability, you generate a vacuum that invites you to be filled. It is basic emotional physics, and it works because it touches something primitive in our psychology. We value more what we should strive to obtain and maintain. Implement this principle requires courage, especially if you are used to total availability. It requires trusting that establishing healthy limits will not move away who really values you, but will strengthen the connection. It requires understanding that your time and attention are valuable resources that should not be delivered without consideration. Start by developing and maintaining your own passions, interests that excite you regardless of your romantic life. When you talk about these interests, your eyes shine in a way that no seduction technique can replicate. That authenticity, that genuine passion acts as an irresistible magnet. Establish routines that you are not willing to constantly sacrifice. Maybe it's your morning training, your night reading sessions, your hiking Sundays. It is not about being rigid, but subtly communicating that you have a structured and significant life, independent of the relationship. Learn to say no without feeling guilty. A no said with kindness, but firmness communicates authorsome. And paradoxically, it is this authors that increases the respect that others feel towards you. When you value your time, others will also. The application of this principle generated in my life a radical change. The women who ignored me began to show interest. The conversations became deeper, the most intense connections. Not because I was playing some kind of manipulative game, but because I was finally living an authentic life that did not depend on constant romantic validation. Irony. It is that when you stop desperately pursuing someone's attention, it is often when you finally get it. When you show that you can be perfectly well on your own, you become someone with whom others want to be. Not by necessity, but by conscious choice. And here is the most difficult part to understand. This apparent contradiction is not manipulation if it comes from a place of authenticity. You are not pretending to have an occupied life. You are really building a rich and significant existence. You are not pretending to be inaccessible. You are simply valuing your time and energy like the precious resources they are. The Machiavellian principle of the perceived value, when applied from integrity, transforms not only how others perceive you, but how you perceive yourself. You begin to understand that your value is not determined by how much you are willing to sacrifice for another person, but for how much you are willing to honor your own path. The third principle of Machiavellian seduction defies our romantic notions about ideal perfection and compatibility. In a world obsessed with the perfect coincidences, the twin souls, and frictionless relationships, Machiavelli would have reminded us of an uncomfortable truth. The most powerful attraction is not born of constant harmony, but from the dynamic tension between opposite forces. I discovered this principle painfully after a relationship that seemed perfect on paper. We shared the same musical tastes, political opinions, hobbies, and even the same sense of humor. The first months were like a dream, a confirmation of all romantic fantasies about finding someone to fit perfectly. However, gradually, something strange began to happen. The intensity faded. The conversations became predictable. The passion, that primary force that had initially united us, began to dilute in the comfort of routine and similarity. It was then that I understood the Machiavellian principle of creative tension. The most magnetic attraction does not arise when two people are exactly one of the other, but when there is the perfect balance between similarity and difference, between comfort and challenge, between the known and the mysterious. Think about basic electricity. The current does not flow between two identical poles. It needs a potential difference. In the same way, the most powerful emotional and sexual energy arises not from the complete similarity, but from dynamic complementarity. It is no coincidence that many of the most intense relationships in history have been among people who constantly challenged themselves, who saw the world from different angles, which contributed complementary energies to the dynamics. The first time I consciously implemented this principle was with a woman who had a radically different vision of mine. Where I was analytical, she was intuitive. Where I planned, she improvised. Our discussions were intense, sometimes heated, but never boring. Each conversation was a discovery, an exploration of unknown territories. And with each disagreement resolved, with each extended perspective, the link was strengthened instead of weakening. I am not suggesting to seek conflict about the mere fact of creating it. Art is to find the precise balance between sufficient similarity to create connection and sufficient difference to maintain creative tension. Too much similarity leads to stagnation, too much difference to fundamental incompatibility. The practical application of this principle begins with something counterintuitive. Stop hiding your genuine opinions for fear of disagreement. Many men, in their eagerness to please, become emotional chameleons, adapting their tastes, opinions, and even values to reflect those of the woman who attracts them. This strategy can work briefly, but inevitably leads to superficial relationships and loss of respect. Instead, learn the art of respectful contradiction. When they differ in opinions, you do not see it as an obstacle, but as an opportunity to deepen the connection. Defend your perspective with passion but without aggressiveness. Genuinely listen to yours, and allow both to grow through exchange. This intellectual and emotional dance creates a much deeper type of intimacy than simple concordance. I remember a night when we discussed a complex philosophical theme. Our perspectives were fundamentally different. The conversation extended until the early hours of the morning, intense, passionate, occasionally frustrated, but always respectful. When we finally reached a mutual understanding, not because it would have won, but because we had both expanded our perspectives, the connection between us was almost electric. The tensai intellectual had become a deep intimacy that no superficial agreement could have generated. The creative tension also operates on the physical plane. The most powerful seduction plays with the rhythm of approach and distance, intensity and softness, of predictability and surprise. It is a dance where both participants are constantly in motion, creating and solving tension in a dynamic balance that never gets stagnant. This principle requires courage. It requires trusting that the relationship is strong enough to support the tension of disagreement and difference. It requires abandoning the childish fantasy of perfect compatibility and embrace the most complex and satisfactory reality of two independent beings who choose to create something together, not despite their differences, but, in part, thanks to them. The most fascinating thing is that when you implement this principle, you not only create a more addictive connection for it, but also for yourself. Relationships based on creative tension never become bored. There is always something new to discover, a new emotional or intellectual territory to explore together. Monotony, that silent murderer of so many promising relationships, simply has no place in a dynamic based on this Machiavellian principle. And here is the deepest paradox. Embrace this principle of creative tension, no distance to people, but creates a more authentic intimacy. Because there is nothing more intimate than allowing someone to see your true perspectives, your authentic opinions, even when they differ from yours, and feel safe in that space of honest difference. The fourth principle of Machiavellian seduction touches one of the deepest and less discussed truths about human nature, our inherent attraction towards what reflects an improved image of ourselves. Machiavelli understood that power is not only exercised through fear or manipulation, but also through the subtle art of becoming a mirror that reflects the best possible version of who is in front of us. I discovered this principle after years of confusion about why certain people generated such a magnetic attraction in others. They were not necessarily the most physically attractive, the most successful, or the most charismatic according to conventional standards. However, when you were with them, you felt smarter, more interesting, more alive, as if your presence somehow amplified the best of yourself. The principle of the amplifier mirror operates at such a deep level of our psychology that we are rarely aware of its influence. It is not simply to flatter or practice active listening, even if these elements are present. It is about developing a genuine ability to see the potential asleep in others and reflect it in ways that they had neither considered. The first time I consciously applied this principle was with an extraordinarily talented but full of insecurities. Instead of simply praising their obvious achievements, something they did, I began to notice and point out aspects of her personality and abilities that she herself underestimated or completely ignored. They were not empty fulfillment, but specific observations based on genuine attention to whom she was in her nucleus. I remember the first time I pointed out how its apparent defect of analyzing too much the situations was actually an extraordinary ability to perceive nuances that others overlooked, or how her tendency to doubt before making decisions, which she considered a weakness, revealed an unusual depth of thought. With each conversation, it was not inventing non-existent virtues, but simply illuminating real qualities that remained in the shadow of their self-concept. The effect was transformative, not only in how she related to me, but how she began to relate to herself. And here lies the addictive power of this principle. When someone helps you see a higher version of yourself, one that you intuited that it existed but you could not access completely, you create a powerful emotional association with that person. Its presence becomes a portal towards your best self. Implement this principle requires developing a fundamental ability: deep observation. You must become a dedicated student of the person who interests you, not superficially or calculatingly, but with a genuine curiosity about who she is beyond the social protection layers, beyond the image she projects to the world, beyond the image of itself. Start by listening not only what he says, but how he says it. Pay attention to when your eyes light up, when your voice acquires a more passionate tone, when your body language expands. These are indicators of its potential areas where there is authentic passion that perhaps has been repressed or underestimated. Look for self-desalification patterns in their speech. We all have limiting narratives about ourselves, stories that we tell ourselves about why we cannot be, do, or have certain things. When you identify these narratives, you have the opportunity to offer a real, evidence-based conversation that you have observed, not in simple adulation. Practice the art of calibrated revelation. In key moments, he shares specific observations on qualities or capacities that you have noticed in it, especially those that you suspect that she does not completely value. The specificity is crucial here. "You are amazing" is a generic compliment that is forgotten in minutes. The way you connected those two apparently unrelated concepts shows a form of lateral thought that very few people possess, is an observation that can resonate for years. The most common error when trying to apply this principle is to confuse it with excessive adulation or idealization. It is not about placing the person on an unreal pedestal, but about illuminating real aspects of their being that remain underdeveloped or undervalued. Excessive adulation is not only transparently manipulative, but it can activate the defense mechanisms of any person with a minimum of self-awareness. The most powerful thing about this principle is that, when applied from a place of authenticity, it creates a virtuous cycle. When reflecting the best of her, she will inevitably begin to reflect the best of you. A dynamic mutual elevation is established that transcends the typical power games in relationships and creates a type of addictive connection based not on dependence or manipulation, but on shared growth. I remember how, over time, our relationship became a space where we both felt smarter, more capable, more alive, where conversations left us energized instead of exhausted, where each interaction seemed to expand our possibilities instead of limiting them. That is the long-term power of the amplifier mirror. It creates a relational field where both people can flourish at its maximum potential. And perhaps the deepest lesson of this Machiavellian principle is that, paradoxically, the path to personal power, more authentic, goes through helping others recognize and inhabit their own power. When you become a catalyst for someone to connect with their inherent greatness, you create a link that transcends superficial attraction dynamics and roots something much more enduring. The fifth principle of Machiavellian seduction breaks with one of the most persistent myths about romantic relationships: the idea that total and indiscriminate vulnerability is the way to authentic intimacy. Machiavelli, with his acute understanding of the psychology of power, would have shown us a more subtle and complex truth. Strategic vulnerability is infinitely more powerful than absolute transparency. I discovered this principle after a series of relationships where I had followed the conventional counsel to open completely from the beginning. I shared my insecurities, fears, failures, and doubts with total transparency, believing that this radical honesty would be the basis of a deep connection. The result, again and again, was disconcerting. An initial interest followed by a gradual but unequivocal distancing. I did not understand what was happening until I studied more deeply the psychology of human attraction. What I discovered contradicted much of what we think about emotional intimacy. Total vulnerability, especially at the beginning of a relationship, not only does not create intimacy, but it can actively sabotage it. The principle of strategic vulnerability recognizes a fundamental truth about how we process emotional information. We value what is gradually revealed, what we discover through a process, much more than what we are given effortlessly. It is the difference between receiving an already developed gift and developing it, cape per cape, with the growing anticipation of what it could contain. The first time I implemented this principle was almost by intuition. After months of meeting a woman who fascinated me, we had a night conversation where, instead of sharing all my insecurities as I used to do, I revealed a single specific vulnerability, one that showed both strength and fragility. I told him about a significant professional failure, but not from self-pity, but from the lessons learned and how that failure had forged important aspects of my character. His reaction was revealing. Instead of the slight disinterest that used to follow my previous confessions, I perceived an immediate deepening of her with Exion with me. His eyes showed no pity, but respect mixed with a new curiosity. I had shared something real, something that showed an authentic fissure in my armor, but I had done it in a way that also demonstrated self-awareness and personal evolution. This is the art of strategic vulnerability. To share genuine aspects of your interiority, but do it in a calibrated way, at the right time, and always showing both the wound and healing, both the challenge and overcoming. The practical implementation of this principle begins with a clear understanding that not all vulnerabilities are equal. Some humanizes, others children. Some create respect, other discomfort. Art is to discern what to share, when and how. Connective vulnerabilities are those that reveal your humanity without undermining your fundamental strength. For example, share how you struggled with doubt during an important project, but you found a way to persevere, or how a significant loss changed you, but it also gave you a new perspective about life. These vulnerabilities create connection because they combine authenticity with resilience. On the contrary, disconnective vulnerabilities are those that, especially at the beginning of a relationship, can activate protection mechanisms in the other person. Extreme insecurities, unresolved emotional dependencies, or constant victimization patterns fall into this category, not because they are less real, but because their premature revelation can overload the emotional system of a nascent relationship. The moment of revelation is as important as its content. I have learned that the deepest vulnerabilities must be gained, not impose themselves. When you share intimate aspects of your being only after the relationship has shown to have the necessary strength to contain them, they become connection points instead of loads. I remember one night, months after meeting us, when I finally shared with her one of my deepest fears. It was not an impulsive confession, but a moment carefully chosen, when trust between us was already solid. What made that moment so powerful was not only what I shared, but what I had decided not to share until then. The fact that there were parts of me that she was gradually discovering, instead of having full access from the beginning. She kept alive an essential tension in our dynamic. The form of revelation also matters deeply. I have discovered that shared vulnerabilities as part of a growth narrative, rather than as simple confessions, have a completely different impact. It is not the same to say, "I am afraid of failure," than to share a specific story where you face that fear. You may succumb to him, but eventually you found a way to integrate it into your personal development. This Machiavellian principle also extends to physical domain. The most powerful seduction operates with the same pace of gradual revelation. The art of revealing and hiding, showing and suggesting, creates an erotic tension that the total exposure from the beginning could never achieve. The most fascinating thing about this principle is that, when applied correctly, not only creates addiction in the other, but genuinely deepens the connection. Because strategic vulnerability is not false or manipulative, it is simply conscious vulnerability. Vulnerability that respects both your own emotional process and that of the other person. I have observed how, over time, this practice transforms the very nature of the relationship. Instead of the childish dynamics of immediate confession and superficial comfort, a space is created where both can reveal deeper layers of themselves in a rhythm that allows true integration and understanding. The addiction it generates is not toxic dependence, but a genuine hunger for continuing to discover the inexhaustible complexity of the other. And perhaps the deepest lesson of this Machiavellian principle is that protecting parts of your interiority is not selfish, but an act of respect for yourself and towards the other person. Respect for the natural process of confidence construction, respect for the other's ability to gain access to your most sacred spaces, and respect for delicate alchemy that transforms two separate individualities into an authentic intimacy that does not dilute, but celebrates the identity of each one. The sixth and final principle of Machiavellian seduction defies our modern understanding of power in romantic relations, the principle of emotional authority. In a world obsessed with absolute equality and the blur of roles, Machiavelli would remind us that human nature responds fundamentally to the presence of authority, not by imposition but by gravid attraction action towards what is firm in a world of constant fluctuation. I discovered this principle after years of trying to be the perfect partner, always comprehensive, always flexible, always willing to yield to avoid conflicts. He firmly believed that this constant adaptability would be valued as the maximum expression of love and consideration. However, over time, I noticed a disconcerting pattern. The more I struggled to please and adapt, less respect and attraction generated. It was as if my infinite flexibility, instead of creating gratitude, was silently eroding something fundamental in dynamics. The principle of emotional authority recognizes an uncomfortable but liberating truth. Human beings do not respect what we can easily manipulate. We respect the clear limits, the unnegotiable values, the internal direction that does not bend to each external pressure. It is no coincidence that the personalities that generate greater long-term attraction are those that, without being rigid or controlling, maintain an unalterable core of principles and self-determination. The first time I consciously implemented this principle was in a relationship that had fallen into a dysfunctional pattern. Before a behavior that crossed my personal limits, instead of adapting or reacting angry, I simply established a clear consequence, without drama or need for justification. When X happens, I will do Y. It is not a threat. It is simply what I need to maintain my well-being in this relationship. The transformation was immediate and deep. What followed was not the departure that he feared so much, but a new level of respect and, surprisingly, an intensification of desire. It was as if establishing clear limits had activated something primary in the dynamics between us, something that responded not to rigidity or control, but to the presence of a solid structure within which intimacy could flourish with greater freedom. This is the heart of the Machiavellian principle of emotional authority. It is not about dominating the other, but to dominate yourself. It is not about imposing your will, but about having a clearly defined will. It is the difference between being a controller and being simply uncontrollable in your essential nucleus. The practical implementation of this principle begins with the clear identification of your non-negotiable values and personal limits. What behaviors are not willing to tolerate in a relationship? What aspects of your life and routine are essential for your well-being? What principles guide your most important decisions? Once identified, art is to communicate these limits not as demands towards the other, but as statements about yourself. It is not, "You can't do X," but "When X happens, I need to do and." This subtle difference completely changes the dynamics, eliminating direct confrontation while clearly establishing the natural consequences of certain actions or patterns. The next step, and perhaps the most difficult, is to maintain these limits with absolute consistency. The emotional authority is built through the congruence between what you say and what you do, between the principles you declare and the actions you take. A limit that is firmly established one day and abandoned the next does not generate respect, but confusion. I remember vividly how this consistency completely transformed a relationship that had been marked by drama and instability. Every time a clearly established limit was crossed, it simply implemented the corresponding consequence without anger, without drama, without extensive explanations. Over time, not only the problematic behaviors decreased, but all the dynamics evolved towards a more mature and satisfactory way to relate. A crucial aspect of emotional authority is its paradoxical nature. Firmness in personal limits allows greater freedom and closeness, no less. When both people know exactly where the limits are, they can move with greater confidence and abandonment within the sure space that these limits create. It is like a well-designed game. Clear rules do not restrict fun, make it possible. This principle also extends to daily decision-making. I have observed how many men, with the intention of being considered, fall into the habit of deferring every small decision to your partner. Where do you want to eat? What movie do you prefer to see? What plans would you like to do this weekend? While consideration is important, constant indecision creates an invisible emotional burden. Someone has to always be making decisions, carrying the weight of the address. Emotional authority implies assuming you're part of that weight. It is not about controlling all decisions, but also having and expressing clear preferences, of taking the initiative when it is appropriate, to have a vision and direction in your life that does not constantly depend on external validation. I have noticed that when I began to practice this principle, not only did romantic dynamics improve, but all my relationships. There was a new clarity in my interactions, an absence of anxiety that arises when you constantly try to adapt your behavior to obtain approval. The emotional authority creates a field of mutual respect where interactions can be more direct, more honest, and, paradoxically, more intimate. The most fascinating thing is that this principle, when implemented correctly, does not create distance but intensifies the connection. Because what we really yearn is not someone who be beaten before each of our whims, but someone who has the inner strength to stay as a stable and reliable presence in a world of constant change. And perhaps the deepest lesson of the Machiavellian principle of emotional authority is this. At a fundamental level, we do not want to possess the other person, but to witness their essential incorruptibility. We do not want someone that we can completely control, but someone who, even in the moments of greater intimacy and vulnerability, maintains that mysterious self-determination nucleus that attracted us in the first place. At the end of the day, what really creates addiction is not a trick or a technique, but the experience of being in front of someone who has dominated the art of being fully human. Someone who understands that the deepest seduction occurs not when we manipulate another, but when we allow ourselves to be authentically who we are, with all our contradictions and complexities. As a scalpel that cuts to the bone of truth, these Machiavellian principles are not deception tools, but portals towards a more honest and powerful way of connection. The question that is suspended in the air as a perfume that persists after someone has left the room is this: are you willing to abandon children's romantic fantasies to embrace the most complex, but infinitely more satisfactory reality of authentic human desire? Are you ready to stop trying to be perfectly complacent and start being perfectly real? Because those who do not dare to assume this truth will continue to be trapped in the maze of superficial relationships, while those who embrace it will discover a world of connection so intense that they transform the soul. This is only the beginning of a path that few have the courage to travel until the end. In our next meeting, I will reveal the deepest layers of these principles. revealing how they intertwine to create a magnetic presence that transcends the simple seduction games. For now, if something I have shared has resonated within you, if you have felt that chill of recognition that arises when a hidden truth comes to light, leave your mark on the comments with these words: I command without saying anything. We will know that you have understood the essence of what it really means creating genuine addiction, not through control, but through the authentic presence that awakens the best in who accompanies you.